Hello everybody and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be comparing the UK and US legislative branches. So essentially I'm comparing Congress with Parliament, and we're going to look at the different aspects of it. We're going to look at the different approaches, the rational, the structural and cultural approaches, and I'm going to have a look at a couple of exam questions as well. So I hope this will be useful to you. As part of my A-level politics playlist, subscribe, loads of videos on there, more to come. Get notifications switched on so you'll know as more arrive. This is from section 6 in the A-level Edexcel specification. So 6.2.3, compare and debate the following aspects of the UK and US, so legislative branches and the resulting impact on politics and government, powers, strengths, weaknesses of each of the houses, the extent to which the houses are equal, and then 6.2.4, the extent to which rational, cultural and structural approaches can be used to account for these similarities and differences. So that is what we're going to look at in a nutshell, and let's crack on. Although we're going to look at lots of differences, there are some basic similarities. Both US and UK are bicameral, so there are two houses essentially. So there's Parliament and the Lords, there's the Commons and the Lords in the UK, and there is the House and the Senate in the US. Both can propose, amend and vote on legislation. They are both accountable to the public, which may lead to them rejecting laws that are proposed by the executive. Obviously, the House of Lords, that accountability bit is a bit, really. They're similar in the role in placing checks on executive power, so through voting on legislation, scrutiny notably through committees. They have a role in determining constitutional rules, be that through amendment or just acts of Parliament in the UK. They have a degree of control over foreign policy, notably declaring war, which can only be done by Parliament, can only be done by Congress, and on voting on executive proposals, and for example, looking at things like treaties. Representation is a really important area for comparison. So in the US Congress, both houses are elected. They're elected for different periods of time, and this complements each other. So we have the Senate, which is elected for 6-year stints, and this helps the trustee model, whilst the House is elected for a very short 2-year periods. So this promotes the idea of the delegate model. Now, there is complete separation of powers, so therefore with Congress being elected separately from the presidency, then we get this idea of often a split ticket voting, where people will deliberately vote for a president of one party and a member of Congress, or a member of the House or the Senate of a different one, in an attempt to balance power between the different branches of government. Again, that is structurally and culturally very different to what happens in the UK. In the UK, Parliament is elected. Now, according to the Fixed Term Parliament Act, it's supposed to be every 5 years, but that act I don't think is very much longer for this world. And since it's been passed, we did have an election 2010, then 2015, but then we had it in 2017, then in 2019. So how long a person stays in Parliament, or the gap between elections, is not set in the UK, which makes it more complicated. And clearly the House of Lords isn't elected at all. And therefore that really does kind of weaken the position of the UK in terms of representation compared to the US. In theory, the House of Commons is responsive to the wishes of the people, whilst obviously the Lords can take a reasoned long-term view and act in the best interests of the UK population. But whether it is representing them is another matter, because they're not elected. Both the UK and the US use first past the post, which damages voter choice and leads to a lack of proportionality between votes and seats. The US is more strongly a two-party system, and in the US we've got the added problem of gerrymandering, where the congressional districts are often set by the state legislature. 31 of the 50 states it's set by the state legislature. So if you get a Republican state legislature, then they tend to set the congressional districts to suit the Republican Party, and vice versa with the Democrats. So that's more of an issue in the US than it is in the UK, where the setting of constituency boundaries is done more independently. Having said that, there are massive issues with the setting of constituency boundaries in the UK as well, and in the disproportionate size of seats. And that's another part of the representation bit with the US, because you get 2 senators no matter how big your state is. So therefore the number of people you're representing is very different. Legislation is the next area we're going to look at. Well, the Congress in this is really powerful. It can amend and block executive proposals, as well as overriding presidential vetoes. We've just seen this with the Defence Act, with Trump's veto being overridden. It can initiate legislation itself without the consent of the executive. So essentially, it is the legislative body. It can just legislate, and the president might object, but they can override any veto that he has. You should, in theory, in the US, get very high quality legislation due to the scrutiny of committees in both houses. However, there is issues with legislation in the US with what is known as pork barreling, which is when members of Congress essentially add perks, bits for their own constituencies, for their own states, to bills to kind of essentially gain their support to vote it through. And in the US, it is really, really hard to pass legislation. Now, often I think of this is in terms of sport. So the US and the UK, I'd say, in terms of passing legislation and sports, are the other way around to each other. So you look at a UK sport like football, and you don't see very many goals scored. So when a goal is scored, it's a really, really big issue. In the US, you have sports like basketball where loads and loads of points are scored, and so actually somebody something failing to score is actually a bigger issue than when they do. And I say this is the other way than the other way around with their legislative programs, because in the UK it's a really big deal if a government fails to pass a piece of legislation. Whilst it's not a big deal if a UK government does pass a piece of legislation, you'd expect them to pass. So if they miss, it's a big deal. In the US, it's the other way around. You essentially start from the premise that they're not going to pass legislation, they're going to fail. And therefore, if they do actually pass some legislation, it's a huge moment for celebration. You have a big kind of press meeting where the president signs the bill in front of everybody, go, look, we actually made some legislation. And so that's really quite a big difference between the two. I mean, Parliament can block bills, but only really the Commons. The House of Lords can only slow them down. Now, this is really unusual, it's because the executive controls the House of Commons. There is scrutiny of bills, particularly in committees, and this again should lead to high quality legislation. It's probably less stringent in the US than it is in the US because of the partisan nature and the fact that the government's going to have a majority on the committees because it's got a majority in the House. Government power in the House of Commons gives bills time, and therefore it means they're quite effectively passed. And therefore, actually, when it comes to legislation, the UK Parliament is a lot more effective, a lot more efficient than the US Congress, because they pass bills. The success rate is much higher. There's a lot fewer bills looked at, and a lot more of them are passed. There is a possibility of private members' bills in the UK, which would be similar to members of Congress raising their own pieces of legislation, but there's very limited opportunity to do this, and very little kind of legislation is initiated this way in the UK compared to in Congress. So in Congress, you would expect a member of Congress to initiate lots of bits of legislation through their time in office, but it's quite a rare occurrence for a backbench member in the UK. Now, depending on the balance within the House of Commons, it's unlikely that it will ever challenge government proposals. Now, we did see an anomaly of this 2017-2019 due to the fact that the Conservatives had a minority government and there was lots of stuff going on about Brexit, and therefore we saw actually loads and loads of government defeats. Boris had a particularly bad run at the beginning of his time as Prime Minister. Now, we would expect that all the time in the US Congress, particularly if you have a president from one party and one of the houses of Congress being controlled by the other. But it should be it should be an uncommon thing in the UK. Now, this links in with the next bit, which is about checks and balances. So Congress has really strong checks on the power of the executive due to separation of powers and this whole thing of checks and balances in the US Constitution. So it can block legislation, it can override vetoes. The Senate can block appointments to the executive and appointments to the judicial branch. So we saw, for example, the Senate standing in the way of one of Obama's picks for the Supreme Court. One of the most famous examples of the treaties one is we saw Woodrow Wilson design the Treaty of Versailles, and then the Senate go, no, we don't like it, we're not backing it. Remarkably, Congress has the power to declare war, though actually the last time we did that was in 1941, which maybe suggests that that's a great power in name, but not necessarily in reality. It also has the power of the purse, which means it can reject the government's budgets, and it can essentially cut its spending off. And did this very notably end of 2018 going into 2019, 35-day shutdown under Trump. Now, you can argue that the checks that the Congress has over the executive are actually too strong, and what it leads to in the US is to complete gridlock. And we've seen quite a long period now with really partisan politics in the US, which again is more unusual than it is in the UK, where the gridlock has really hampered, first of all, Obama and then Trump really doing anything of note in the second half of Obama's time in office and through the entire 4 years under Trump. And it hampers effective government. Now, this is particularly the case when we see the president and one House of Congress being of different parties, and it is arguable that the kind of partisan checking of a president can become rather excessive, and that's definitely an argument that Trump would make about the treatment of him by the Democrats and Pelosi in the House of Representatives over the last 2 years. Now, Parliament can check government through voting. It has the select committees, and we get Prime Minister's Question Time every Wednesday, and they can use that to check up on the government and what they're doing. They can ultimately get rid of the government through a vote of no confidence, which is a much easier procedure than an impeachment, but again is very rare because the government doesn't tend to vote for its own destruction. So the checks in Parliament are rather weak on government, particularly if the government has a majority, particularly as a government of any size, and it can use its whips and patronage to make sure it gets bills passed and it makes its backbenchers behave. And it's only the Commons that has extensive powers to check control on the government, and this is a real flaw in the system because it's the Commons that tends to be dominated by the government. The Lords can merely delay things. So when it comes to checks, there really is a disparity between the two countries, and the checks on government that Congress has are far better or far stronger than they are in the UK. You could argue the US's are too strong. So if we go into a bit more comparison between the houses, so if we compare the House of Representatives to the Commons, well, they're both elected. Now, the House of Representatives, the members are elected for 2-year terms. In the UK, theoretically, it's 5 years, but again, that tends to vary. Now, the House of Representatives, therefore, is highly responsive to public opinion because really, as a member of the House, you never stop campaigning, really, unless you're in a particularly safe district, because you win an election, then it's only 2 years until your next one. So the kind of the speed of turnover of that, if you are not responding to what your constituents want, the chances are you'll be out on your ear. Having said that, incumbency rates are very high. Now, there arguably is a stronger tradition in the UK of aiming to represent the whole of the constituency rather than just the people that elected you. Again, that will vary from place to place in both the UK and the US. Both the House of Commons and the House of Representatives have special control over finance bills. The Commons in this doesn't face any kind of check from the upper house, whilst the House of Representatives does. The House has special power to impeach members of the executive and judiciary, notably the president, as we saw with Trump in the not too distant past. And it has a great deal more independence than the House of Commons. The House of Commons really is, particularly in situations like we have at the moment with a party with a large majority, very firmly in the control of the hands of the executive. The House of Commons is without question the dominant house in the UK and holder of parliamentary sovereignty, whilst the House in America is often seen as being less important than the Senate. I mean, there is a debate about that, but generally speaking, it's seen as the less prestigious house. So if we compare the Senate with the Lords, well, the Senate is elected for 6-year terms. A third of the Senate is elected every 2 years. Now, some people argue that this is too long, particularly because incumbency rates being re-election are very high. But it must be said this is much better than the House of Lords that's not elected at all, and therefore lacks a real sense of legitimacy. I mean, it's not hereditary anymore, they are now appointed, but even so, this doesn't really overcome this problem to a great extent. Some states have overrepresentation through the Senate because it's 2 per state regardless of size. So you can see California being rather irritated by the fact that Alaska has the same number of senators as it does. And it does essentially mean that some Americans are better represented than others. And the House of Lords is gigantic. It is actually, on raw numbers, the second biggest upper chamber in the world, second only to China. Not all members of the House of Lords turn up all the time, if at all. But again, it is really odd that the UK Houses of Parliament are bigger than the US Houses of Congress, particularly as the US is so much bigger than the UK. The idea of the upper houses is they both take a longer term view of what is best for the people. So the Senate aren't seeking re-election as frequently as a member of the House. The members of the House of Lords aren't seeking re-election at all. The House of Lords is not strongly affected by the executive branch because it doesn't have members of the government really in it, you don't have the same idea of party discipline in the Lords, and you've got lots of crossbenchers, so that would make it more similar to the Senate. So both can represent people's objections to an unpopular government policy, but only the Senate can block it. The House of Lords can't, and this goes back to the Salisbury Convention and Parliament Acts, which have strongly restricted the power of the Lords, quite rightly so, because it's unelected. Now, the Senate can remove a president and others from office through impeachment trials. The Senate also has special powers over appointments and treaties, and these are things that we just don't see in the House of Lords. Now, both, however, are seen as bringing a degree of experience and expertise and kind of study of the law and making sure that everything's done correctly. Again, and part of that is because they aren't chopping and changing all the time with lots of elections. Right, the extent to which each house is equal, well, there's various ways that you could look at this. Actually, you could be asked internally, so do you have equality between the 2 houses within the UK? And then the other one could be then, would you have equality between the power of the houses in the UK and the houses in the US? When in the US, the Senate is seen as the more significant of the 2 houses, and that is debatable, but I think most people would agree the Senate has a degree more prestige. So that is relatively straightforward. The UK one is completely straightforward. The House of Commons is definitely the most significant of the 2 houses in the UK. So the Senate has power over appointments and treaties, ratifying those that the House doesn't. You can argue it's more prestigious because you have a longer term. You're representing a larger area. That's not always the case because you do end up with states that have only got 3 representatives, and therefore, if you're all representing the whole state. There are only 100 members of the Senate, while there are 435 members of the House, so you're one of the smaller number. And moving from the House to the Senate is often seen as career progression in US politics, whilst moving from the House of Commons to the House of Lords is kind of retirement in the UK. Despite the above, the 2 houses in the US are far more equal than those in the UK. In the UK, only the Commons has the right to block bills. The Lords can only delay. The Lords has no say on finance bills or anything that's been enacted from a government's manifesto. In the UK, only MPs in the House of Commons are paid, whilst actually in the US we've got equality. The US senators and the members of the House are actually paid the same amount of money. I think it's $178,000 a year. Separation of powers and checks and balances give the US Congress more independence and the power to block the will of the executive, and they've got more power to initiate their program. So in that you would suggest that the houses of Congress have greater power than the US Parliament. But that's in terming as long as you're talking about it as legislature versus executive. Now, obviously, it's not that straightforward because in the UK they tend to be one and the same thing pretty much, and so what Congress can't compete with is the idea of parliamentary sovereignty that we have in the UK. So in the UK, Parliament is sovereign. That is where all the power lies. That's where ultimately the decisions are made. Whilst Congress in the US has got two other branches of government to compete with, and checks and balances placed on its power. So ultimately, Parliament holds more power, but that power is controlled to quite a large extent by the executive. So it's difficult on that element to compare them. So if you're looking at legislative versus executive, then the US is stronger. But if you're looking at overall power of a legislative body, then the House of Commons in the UK is the most powerful of the four. Now, you might be asked to do one of these in a question too, in which case you would use the different approaches. So if we've got the rational approach, well, this can be valuable assessing the role and decision of individual politicians, either members of either houses of Congress or either members of the Houses of Parliament. Now, in the House of Commons, there is greater party discipline than there is in the US Houses. And therefore more pressure on politicians to vote in a particular way. In the US, you'd expect US politicians to be more able to follow their own rational self-interest. Now we're seeing this, as I made this video, being demonstrated by Republicans in both houses in January 2020, as we're seeing all the fighting over the final confirmation of the election result. But both have to, in America, have to consider upcoming elections, and they're very frequent, particularly for the House of Representatives, but there is still re-election to the Senate. Now, the House of Lords, you can argue, members of the House of Lords can follow a completely rational approach because they're not elected, so they don't have to worry about the electorate. There's very little party discipline, a huge number of independent crossbench members of the House of Lords, so they are free to act completely rationally of their own beliefs and their own self-interest. And so, really, for the House of Lords, the rational approach is by far and away the most appropriate. And for the American houses, it's probably a stronger element than it is in the UK House of Commons. Now, another person, pair of people you might look at in terms of the rational approach are the Prime Minister and the President. So both try and assert their control over the houses of the legislatures, and they both try and pass legislation, and both are impacted on by the balance of power in the legislature. In the UK, individual popularity of a Prime Minister tends to match the popularity of a party. So if you've got a really popular Prime Minister, then they've probably got a big majority, whilst you can have a very popular US President who doesn't have a majority. And this, for example, was seen with Obama. The cultural approach is a really interesting one. So in this would be the elements look at the role of parties. Now, traditionally, the role of the parties is much stronger in the UK, but there is increasing partisanship in the US, and so we're seeing the parties becoming more and more important. So there is this desire to work to common values, and that has an impact on the behaviour of politicians in the US and the UK. So it's always been the case that you've wanted a united party in the UK, and only united parties tend to win elections. Now, this idea of party unity is becoming stronger and stronger in the US as well, and it is leading to some fairly major problems with huge gridlock because the structure of their system isn't designed for it, really. Convention is also really important in both the US and the UK. So, for example, the Lords not opposing bills in government manifestos. In the US, you've got Congress generally gives way to the President over foreign policy, whilst acts differently over domestic issues. And we've also got the bit I talked about earlier with this expectation about the ability to pass pieces of legislation. So there's a cultural expectation in the UK that a government will pass legislation, whilst there isn't that expectation in the same level in the US, where the need for compromise and the fact that most bills will fail is just the norm. The structural approach, again, always my favourite, this one, and we can pick out lots of different bits from this. So both are bicameral, though strangely the UK houses are bigger, despite it being a much smaller country. So you can look at political structures, and particularly looking at the two constitutions. Congress has much greater power of check on the executive because of separation of powers. Whilst in the UK, you've got this fusion of the executive and the legislative branches, and this leads to the power tending to be concentrated in government hands. Now, the rules on elections lead to structural differences, noticeably between the Lords and the Senate, where the Lords isn't elected and the Senate is, and this leads to the upper chamber in the UK lacking legitimacy. You can also look at the idea of focus. So in the UK, the idea is that both houses focus on everything, whilst there's more areas of speciality. In America, with the Senate focusing more on foreign policy and the House more on domestic issues, notably on anything to do with finance bills. And so you've got more of a slight split in focus in the US than you've got in the UK, which is a structural thing. The committee stages are also very different. So although they essentially do the same job, in the US they do it before a motion hits a bill hits the debate floor for the whole House, whilst in the UK it happens after the second reading. And this is partly goes back to the expectations of stuff passing, but it does mean structurally things are done very, very differently. Now, here's some exam questions that have been asked in the past. So one's a question 1, examine how the powers of the US Congress and UK Parliament are limited in different ways. So it's a difference question. And again, we've got a question 2, analyse the different legislative powers of the UK Parliament and US Congress. So just concentrate on legislative powers on that bit, so you don't talk about the other ones. And that's a question 2, so we have to talk about comparative theories. So I'm just going to talk through some of the stuff you do with these. So examine how the powers of the US Congress and UK Parliament are limited in different ways. Well, powers are distributed less equally in the UK than in the US. The House of Lords can only delay legislation, cannot challenge finance bills or items in government manifesto, whilst the Senate has special powers over appointments and treaties. The House has power of the purse. So the split in power is different. So there are splits of power in both the US and the UK, but the way that the power is distributed is different in the two. They're not the same in terms of separation of powers. So there's much greater separation of powers in the US. This means that, again, things like the UK Parliament experiences a lot less gridlock. They're different in terms of elections, and this again leads to differences in powers, because you've got the members of the House elected for 2 years and members of the Senate elected for 6. They aren't fixed in the UK, though this has been tried, and the House of Lords aren't elected at all. So this limits the level of power placed on legislatures by the people. So the people have very little control over the House of Lords, but equally, on the flip of that, it changes the degree of power that the houses have. So the House of Lords, because of its lack of legitimacy and lack of elections, has very limited power. Another area of this is, again, I'm not sure this is a hugely brilliant point, but in the US, the president can veto bills that go through Congress. The Queen tends not to. Well, she just doesn't. She just signs them, and that would be a different bit there. I mean, I suppose you could have the Prime Minister essentially blocking, or the government blocking, private members' bills, which might be something similar. But again, so that would be some key differences in between the powers. And again, in answering that one, you'd have to keep coming back to powers and make sure you're not just describing functions of why this means the power of the houses in the UK and the houses in the US are different. So the next one is a question 2. Analyse the different legislative powers of the UK Parliament and the US Congress. And this one, you'd have to bring in the different ideas, the different approaches. So the US Congress is considered to have more significant legislative powers than the UK Parliament because of separation of powers, give its independence from the executive. The US Congress can override any presidential veto over legislation done most recently over Trump's veto of the Defence Act in 2020. The UK Parliament simply cannot do this, and this is a structural issue. It's down to the setup in the Constitution, so you could look at that using the structural approach. The House of Lords is only a revising chamber rather than playing an equal executive role with the House of Commons, so there's a difference in equality when it comes to legislation here. because it's shared equally in the US, the House of Lords can only delay legislation for up to 1 year, ultimately can be overruled by the House of Commons. And this is different in the US because the two houses of Congress have to agree on proposal and any amendments made to it before it can be passed. Neither house can actually force its will on the other. So that's very, very different aspect of the legislative powers in the US and the UK. And that's about expectations of role. So I would look at that as a element of the cultural approach. Now, one of the real big differences, I think, between the two is this idea of gridlock. Now, this really can be really damaging in terms of US's Congress' ability to pass legislation because of separation of powers. I mean, they can override a presidential veto, but they need a 2/3 majority in both houses, and that's quite rare. Now, it's just not the case in the UK. Both houses must agree on a format before a bill can be passed and taken to the president for signing. Well, the House of Commons and the House of Lords don't have to agree. The House of Commons can just wait a year and override whatever the House of Lords says. The US president is really reliant on the US Congress, in particular its leadership, to actually introduce and debate their legislative program. And in divided government, gridlock becomes really, really likely, and we see this. One of the best examples of this is the shutdown 2018-19 of the entire federal government for 35 days. In contrast to this, the UK very, very rarely suffers gridlock. Now, we did see it over Brexit, and the way that the UK Parliament, the UK public and the UK media responded to it was like it was the end of the world, the most terrible kind of travesty of anything that ever happened, that we couldn't get agreement out of Parliament what they wanted to do. Well, it's actually in the US, this is just normal. So those things are very, very different. Now, the fusion of powers, that means that the executive, the cabinet, dominate the legislative branch, in particular the House of Commons, means that gridlock is really unlikely. And again, I would use the rational model for this, looking for the Prime Minister's ability to avoid gridlock whilst the President doesn't have that same ability. I hope that's been useful for you. If it has been, please hit the like button. If you have any questions or queries or comments, then please leave those in the comment section below. If you haven't done so already, then please subscribe and turn on notifications. As I've said, I am looking to cover the entirety of the A-level politics spec, and if you've subscribed and you've got notifications on, then you'll get notified of new videos when they're added. And I'm also doing a whole range of stuff on history as well. So if you're interested in that as well, you'll get a whole heap of other videos to look at. Again, thank you very much for watching.